In the previous video, we saw a remarkable story unfold right in front of our eyes. From the dawn of times until very recently, most of humanity lived in sheer misery. But how do we know it did? We use a measure of how well people live. We call this measure GDP per capita. Per capita means per person. So, to arrive at a measure of how well the average person lives, we need to divide GDP by the number of people living in that economy. But what is GDP? GDP is the market value of the output produced for final consumption in a certain economy over a given period. Let's unpack the elements of this concept. First, we have the market value. The market value of something is what? How much you have produced times what you sell it for. In other words, this is the quantity of goods and services produced for final consumption times how much each of these goods and services are priced at. Second, there's this concept of final consumption. Final consumption means that a certain good or service is being sold to its ultimate consumer. For example, to produce a vaccine for COVID, we employ researchers, laboratories, materials, and human trial services. Each of those inputs into the production of a vaccine has some price, and the vaccine producer has paid the price. But as the value of those goods and services used in the production of the vaccine are not used for final consumption, that is, they're not used by their ultimate consumer, they're not counted in the value of GDP. So the market value of the vaccines produced for final consumption, however, is counted as part of the GDP. So until a certain good or service reaches its ultimate consumer, we don't count it as part of GDP. We call the value of the goods and services used in the production of something else intermediate consumption, and as opposed to final consumption. In our vaccine example, the staff costs, the material input costs, the laboratory rent, the human trial remuneration, as well as the managerial cost of the vaccine producers are counted as intermediate goods or intermediate consumption. As a result, the value of those intermediate inputs is not counted as part of GDP. The vaccine, however, is the final good, the good used for final consumption, so its market value, the number of vaccines produced times their market price, is part of the GDP. So, if we sum up the value of all goods and services produced for final consumption, we will get to know the value of GDP. Notice one important fact. What happens to those goods and services once they have been produced? Of course, they're being sold to by their producers. Once sold, however, the revenues they generate become income for the owners of the companies which have produced them. The companies move this income further down the value chain to its managers, to its employers, and its other intermediate suppliers. All the revenue that selling the final goods and services generated has been transformed into income. That is why sometimes we tend to think of the gross domestic product as a value which is very similar, if not the same as the gross domestic income. Talking about income, once the income is received by the people who took part in the production of GDP, it is also being taxed by the government. We will learn more about taxation later on, but for now it is important to note that the government taxes people to be able to generate money for various services, such as defense of national borders, policing the streets, courts, prisons, company registers, customs services, intelligence against foreign risks and threats, research and education, unemployment benefits, furlough schemes, economic policy making, and in general, anything not in the prerogative of the private sector, and anything which is hard to price and charge for by the private sector. So the government taxes the people to be able to deliver those services. In exchange, people agree to live buy if there was, people agreed to live by lower amounts of money relative to what they would have lived if there was no government. This is how we arrive at a measure of income reflecting not the actual income people earn, but this income minus the amounts of taxes people pay for that particular income. This is what we call disposable income. If you want to learn more about these two concepts, please feel free to click on the link below. Right. I believe we can fully understand what GDP and disposable incomes are about. However, plotting the GDP over time, there are additional challenges that we need to think of. Notice that GDP was the market value of the goods and services. Then, by definition, it entails the multiple of prices and quantities. However, everyone knows that prices do change from time to time, even though those changes are rather hard to notice. Within a year or two, prices tend to go up. Then, any change in the value of the GDP will be driven by a change in a price, not by how much was produced. In other words, we need to know if the change in GDP was real or not. A real change in GDP is when GDP changes due to the changes in the underlying quantity of the good or service being produced, not due to its price change. That's why we want to separate the real change in GDP from the nominal one. In other words, we want to isolate the impact of the changes in prices on the value of what we measure. This is how we get to know the real GDP, the one driven by how much is being produced, not by how much it costs on the market. So to isolate the impact of prices, we fix the prices and keep them constant between 2 points in time. Finally, a general principle of measuring GDP is to keep prices comparable, not only over time within a country, but also across countries. This is especially necessary when we measure output or income at a certain point in time between two economies. What do I have in mind? I'll give you a hypothetical example. Imagine that GDP per capita in the UK is £30,000 per year, and the GDP per capita in Ukraine is £10,000 per year. Does this mean that the average British citizen lives 3 times better than the average Ukrainian? Not at all. But why? Because prices in the two countries are vastly different. In the UK, the average person will pay at least twice as much for rent, 3 times as much for transportation, and 50% more for food and drinks. We have a way to measure the price differences across 2 or more countries, and we can say how much more on average do British citizens pay. Assume it is twice as much. So within 3 times the income of Ukrainians, but twice the prices, Brits can hardly be 3 times richer than Ukrainians, can they? I'll leave it up to you to decide how much richer Brits are. With these general principles in mind, we can return to studying the differences between nominal and real GDP. So let's go back to the concept of GDP. We said that it's the market value of all goods and services produced for final consumption in an economy over a certain period. We also said that to arrive at this market value, we need to multiply the prices of those goods with their quantities. But which prices and which quantities? If we multiply the current prices and current quantities of the produced goods, then we arrive at a measure of nominal GDP. So you sum up the product of current prices and current quantities for all goods and services produced in an economy over a quarter or over a year, and you have the measure of nominal GDP in that country in that period. We can also formally state that in any given period, GDP is the sum of the product of PI and QI for all I's, where I stands for the variety of goods and services produced. if we simplify this economy to just one good and one price, then the nominal GDP will be the product of the two. Why do we need this simplification? Remember that we said that prices and quantities change over time. Let's stick to this very simple economy with just one good which has a price. We can say that the nominal GDP in this economy for year 1 is P1 Q1. As the nominal GDP is the product of the current price and the current quantity, we can say that the nominal GDP in year 2 will be what? It will be P2 Q2. But then we have a real problem with the nominal GDP. The problem is that the nominal GDP will grow and we will not know why it has grown. It is because prices have changed. Is it because prices have changed or because quantities have changed? If only prices have changed and the economy has not produced anything new, then we can say there is something real, there is some real growth in this economy. Well, not really. The nominal GDP will be different, but as the economy has not produced any new quantity of its goods, then we can safely say that it has not really grown. Therefore, we can say that real GDP growth was 0, even though there was some nominal GDP growth. So, how do we know if there was real growth in this economy? We need to have a way to isolate the impact of the price growth from the impact of real quantity growth on the measure of GDP. Luckily, we have it, and it's very easy to do. So we define the real GDP as the GDP measured in constant prices. So for example, the real GDP for year 2 will be the product of the quantity in year 2 multiplied by the price in year 1. In turn, the real GDP in year 3 will be the product of the quantity in year 3 with the same price in year 1. Thus, we have a way to eliminate the impact of the increase in the price on the measure of the economy. So if there is growth in the quantity produced in this economy over time, not in its price, we can say that there is real GDP growth. Note also that we can very easily move between nominal and real GDP by using the so-called GDP deflator. Take the measure of real GDP for year 2. That is P1 Q2. Nothing will change in this measure if we multiply and divide it by the same number, right? So this number is P2. But notice that P2 is the nominal GDP for year 2. We can also turn P1 over P2 around and present it as 1 over P2 divided by P1. This last multiple is what we call the GDP deflator. It helps us move between nominal and real GDP for a given year very easily. So, by using the GDP deflator for each year, we can construct a series representing the real GDP for all the years of data in a certain country. This is how we compare the GDP of a country over time. So what do we do with this knowledge? We go to the data. Let's see, if we plot the real GDP per capita for a number of countries over a very long time, we will be able to compare how they grew to become what they are today. Each point in this figure is an observation corresponding to the real GDP in that country in that particular time. In this figure, time is plotted on the horizontal axis, while real GDP per capita is on the vertical axis. Notice how the vertical axis is constructed, however. It is not a typical linear scale. It's the so-called ratio scale, also known as the logarithmic scale. In this ratio or logarithmic scale, the distance between the numbers is the same, but each number is twice as large as the previous one. Logarithmic scales are typically used when we compare data of a very different magnitude across 2 or more countries. Logarithmic scales also show you very easily if an economy is taking off or not, and if it catches up other economies. So let's connect the dots here. What do we really see? We see that for the better part of the last millennium, people did not change their lifestyles much. They lived in the same slums, ate the same food, and were doing the same thing generation in, generation out. They were simply surviving. That changed in the 18th century when Britain started taking off. In other words, it started growing at an accelerated pace. So let's focus on Britain. Other countries like Italy and Japan followed suit, but it happened in the 19th century. At the same time, the catch-up was fast and furious. A similar catch-up process was happening much later with China and India. It is still happening to this day, because those countries grow faster than Western countries and Japan. There is no doubt that it is a matter of time for them to catch up completely. However, note that this catch-up is not guaranteed. To catch up, you need to grow faster than the rest. If both countries grow at the same rate, the two logarithmic scales or series will run parallel to each other, and the poorer country will just never catch up. So a steeper curve means a country is growing faster than another country, like Britain's curve in the 18th and the 19th centuries, and like China's and India's curves in the last 40 years. If a country does not grow faster than the rest of the countries, it will simply not be able to catch up, and this growth is not guaranteed. Let's briefly summarize what we've learned until now. So the history of mankind was a history of misery. Most people lived in the same dismal conditions, not very different from the conditions their predecessors lived in. Their children were also destined to live in approximately the same conditions for the rest of their lives. All changed about 250 years ago when Britain took off as a result of a phenomenon we now call the First Industrial Revolution. Taking off means experiencing a different type of growth than before. An accelerated and sustained growth allows for a better average living standards over time. We measure those average living standards by the real GDP per capita. The growth of this real GDP per capita started accelerating in Britain first, and in a sustained fashion, followed by some parts of the rest of the world. Note that this takeoff, the process which enabled this sustained growth, the Industrial Revolution, if you wish, occurred at different points in time for different countries. And as a result, some countries ended up much richer than others, even though all started with similarly dismal living standards a few hundred years ago. In the next video, we will briefly discuss that the takeoff happened because of two factors: technological progress and an economic system which facilitated the creation of technological progress. We'll also see some of the measures of this progress. Thanks, and keep watching.